A mother answered the phone that Friday afternoon, hearing her 11-year-old daughter's voice on the other end. The girl was tired. The California heat was overwhelming. She just wanted a ride home from summer school, but her mother was busy with a deadline. She told her daughter to walk. It was less than a mile. It would be fine. 20 minutes later, witnesses saw the little girl talking to a stranger in a turquoise van. 1 minute after that, both were gone. By the next sunrise, her body was discovered in a marsh 3 miles away. The van had vanished into thin air. For 47 years, no one knew who he was. No one could find him. He disappeared completely, living under a different name, pretending to be someone else, thinking he had escaped justice forever. But DNA doesn't forget. Science doesn't give up. And neither do we. And this is the untold cold case. Tonight, we're reopening a file that changed forensic investigation forever. A case that proved time is no longer the enemy of justice. A story that begins in the summer of 1973 and doesn't end until nearly half a century later, when technology finally caught a killer who thought he was untouchable. Stay with me. This one will leave you speechless. Picture California in the summer of 1973. The Vietnam War was winding down. Watergate hearings dominated the news. Gas prices were rising. But in Newport Beach, a quiet coastal community nestled along the Pacific Ocean, life felt insulated from the chaos of the outside world. This was a town where children rode their bicycles to the beach without supervision, where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar from each other, where front doors stayed unlocked at night because crime felt like something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. The summers here stretched endlessly, golden afternoons melting into warm evenings, the sound of seagulls echoing over manicured lawns and palm trees swaying in the gentle ocean breeze. It was the kind of place people dreamed about, safe, peaceful, idyllic. In the Corona del Mar neighborhood, tucked away on a street called Galaxy Drive, lived the O'Keefe family. Richard O'Keefe worked as a machinist, steady and dependable, a man who believed in hard work and providing for his family. His wife, Barbara, was a talented seamstress who worked from home, creating beautiful handmade clothes with a mother's love stitched into every seam. They had 3 children. The middle child was a girl named Linda Ann O'Keefe. She was 11 years old that summer with long brown hair, curious blue eyes, and a face that radiated innocence and kindness. Her friends called her Lenny. To those who knew her, she was gentle, creative, and compassionate beyond her years. She loved reading Nancy Drew mystery novels, imagining herself as a detective solving crimes. She dreamed of becoming a piano teacher someday. Every afternoon you could hear her practicing scales and simple melodies on the family piano, the notes drifting through the open windows of their home. Linda had a special connection with nature and animals. She would stop during her walks to feed birds, pet stray dogs, and pick wildflowers to bring home to her mother. On family camping trips in the redwood forests, she would sit perfectly still, waiting for salamanders and butterflies to come close, as if they trusted her gentle presence. Her older sister, Cindy, would later describe her as the kindest soul you could ever meet, the type of child who saw good in everyone, who believed the world was fundamentally safe, who trusted that people meant what they said. That summer, Linda was attending classes at Lincoln Intermediate School, part of a program that kept kids engaged during the long vacation months. It was her last week before summer officially began, and like most 11-year-olds, she was counting down the days until freedom. Friday, July 6, 1973, started like any other day. Linda wore her favorite dress that morning, a blue and white checkered pattern that her mother had sewn specifically for her. She carried a small homemade bag over her shoulder, filled with her schoolbooks and a pencil case. Normally, Linda rode her turquoise bicycle to school. She loved that bike. It gave her independence, a sense of freedom. But that particular morning, her piano teacher had given her a ride after an early lesson, which meant her bicycle remained at home. This meant Linda would need to walk home after school. And that detail, small and seemingly insignificant, would change everything. The walk from Lincoln Intermediate School to Galaxy Drive wasn't long, just under a mile. The route took her down Marguerite Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with eucalyptus trees and modest homes. It was a walk Linda had made countless times, safe, familiar, unremarkable. But that Friday, Linda didn't want to walk. The summer heat was oppressive, beating down on the pavement and making the air shimmer. She wasn't feeling well. She was tired. She wanted her mother to come pick her up. When classes ended around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Linda went to the school office. This was 1973, remember. No cell phones, no text messages, just one rotary phone sitting on the office desk with students lining up to use it. Linda waited her turn. When she finally got through to her mother, she asked softly, hopefully, if Barbara could please come get her. It was hot. She didn't have her bike. She really didn't want to walk. Barbara O'Keefe was at her sewing machine working on a deadline. She had fabric spread across the dining room table, patterns pinned carefully, thread running through her fingers. She was focused, busy, trying to finish a project. When she heard Linda's request, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She gently told her daughter no. The walk wasn't far. Linda would be fine. She should just come straight home. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Linda's quiet voice. "Okay, Mom." Cindy, Linda's older sister, was in another room of the house. She heard the phone conversation. She heard the disappointment in her little sister's voice. Years later, she would remember that moment with painful clarity, the silence that followed their mother's answer. Barbara returned to her sewing, having no idea that she had just heard her daughter's voice for the last time. Around 1:15 that afternoon, Linda left the school building. Several classmates saw her sitting on the curb near the parking lot, looking upset. They thought maybe she was still waiting for a ride, still hoping her mother might change her mind and show up. Then the other kids waved goodbye and headed home. Linda sat there for several more minutes, alone with her thoughts, probably watching the street for her mother's car. When no car came, she stood up. She brushed off her blue and white checkered dress, and she began walking toward Marguerite Avenue, the route that would take her home. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, warm but not unbearable, the kind of day where you could hear birds singing and smell jasmine blooming in front yards. Linda probably hummed one of her piano tunes as she walked, her homemade bag swinging at her side. But somewhere along that familiar route, something happened. Something that would shatter the peace of Newport Beach forever. If you're still with me, type "I'm still watching" in the comments. Because what happens next is where this case takes its darkest turn. A teenage girl named Janine was riding in a car with her mother that Friday afternoon. They were driving through the neighborhood, running errands, when something caught Janine's attention. At the corner of Marguerite Avenue and Inlet Drive, she saw a young girl standing on the sidewalk talking to a man in a vehicle. The vehicle was distinctive, a turquoise-colored van, the kind you couldn't easily forget. The man appeared to be in his 20s or early 30s. He had curly brown hair and tanned skin. He was leaning out of the passenger side window talking to the girl who stood on the curb. The girl was wearing a blue and white checkered dress. She was carrying a small bag. She looked like any other kid walking home from school. To Janine and her mother, the interaction seemed normal. Maybe the man was asking for directions. But maybe he knew the girl. There was nothing obviously threatening about the scene. So they continued driving. They didn't stop. They didn't intervene. They had no reason to think anything was wrong. The time was approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. And that moment, that brief sighting, would become the last confirmed time anyone saw Linda Ann O'Keefe alive. At that exact moment, the community of Newport Beach had no idea that danger was lurking in their midst. There had been no warnings, no reports of suspicious vehicles, no alerts about strangers approaching children. Newport Beach prided itself on being one of the safest cities in California. Violent crime was almost non-existent. The police department was small, dealing mostly with traffic violations and the occasional vandalism. And the idea that someone could abduct and harm a child in broad daylight seemed impossible. But somewhere between that street corner and her home, Linda disappeared. The girl who had been walking in sunshine, probably thinking about dinner and weekend plans, simply vanished. Back at the O'Keefe house on Galaxy Drive, Barbara continued working at her sewing machine. 2 o'clock came and went, then 2:30. By 3 o'clock she began to feel the first stirrings of worry. The walk from school should have taken Linda 20 minutes at most. Even if she had stopped to look at something, to pet a dog, to pick flowers, she should have been home by now. Barbara put down her sewing and went to the window. The street was quiet, empty. No sign of Linda. By 3:30, worry had transformed into something sharper. Barbara started making phone calls. She called neighbors, asking if Linda had stopped by their houses. She called Linda's friends, asking if anyone had seen her after school. No one had. By 5 o'clock, panic had fully set in. Richard O'Keefe came home from work to find his wife frantic with worry. Cindy was checking with all of Linda's classmates. The phone was ringing constantly as Barbara called everyone she could think of. Richard immediately got in the car with Cindy. They drove slowly through the neighborhood, following the route from school to home, calling Linda's name out the windows. They checked the small park where she sometimes played. They checked the market where she occasionally stopped for candy. Nothing. No trace of her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Corona del Mar, the reality became inescapable. Something was terribly wrong. Linda wasn't at a friend's house. She hadn't gotten distracted and lost track of time. She was missing. At 6 o'clock that evening, Barbara O'Keefe's hands trembled as she dialed the Newport Beach Police Department. Her voice broke as she reported her 11-year-old daughter missing. The officer who took the call recognized the urgency immediately. This wasn't a teenager who had run away after an argument. This was an 11-year-old girl who had simply failed to come home from school. A good kid, a responsible kid. The kind of child who didn't just disappear. Within the hour, police officers arrived at the O'Keefe home. They asked for recent photographs of Linda. They asked what she had been wearing. They asked about her route home from school. They asked if she had seemed upset lately, and if there had been any problems at home, if she might have run away. Barbara answered each question through tears. No problems at home, no reason to run away. Linda was happy, she was gentle, she was trusting, she would never just leave. The officers took the information and immediately radioed for backup. Within minutes, patrol cars were spreading out across Newport Beach, searching for an 11-year-old girl in a blue and white checkered dress. As darkness fell over the quiet coastal town, the search intensified. More officers arrived. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined in. People grabbed flashlights and began walking through alleys, checking behind buildings, looking in storm drains and empty lots. The Newport Beach Police Department set up checkpoints on Pacific Coast Highway and the surrounding roads. Every vehicle was being stopped and checked. Officers were specifically looking for turquoise or blue-green vans based on the witness description that Janine and her mother had provided. Police helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across parks and vacant land. The sound of the rotors echoed through the night, a reminder that something terrible had happened in this safe, peaceful community. Back at the O'Keefe house, Barbara sat by the phone, praying it would ring with good news. Cindy couldn't stop crying. Richard paced the living room, feeling helpless and desperate. Neighbors brought food that no one could eat. Friends offered comfort that couldn't penetrate the fear. Everyone waited, everyone hoped, everyone prayed that Linda would be found safe. But as the night wore on with no sign of her, hope began to fade. As the officers' expressions grew more serious, the search teams became more urgent. Everyone was thinking the same thing, though no one wanted to say it out loud. Something bad had happened to Linda O'Keefe. The sun rose on Saturday, July 7th, 1973, bringing with it no relief from the nightmare that had begun the day before. Search teams had been working through the night, but Linda remained missing. Around 7 o'clock that morning, a maintenance worker was doing his rounds near the Back Bay, a marshy natural preserve area about 3 miles from where Linda was last seen. The Back Bay was a beautiful ecological area, home to birds and wildlife, with tall reeds and cattails growing along the water's edge. As the worker walked along the path, something caught his eye, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Something blue and white. He moved closer. And then he saw her. Linda Ann O'Keefe was lying in the marsh, still wearing the blue and white checkered dress her mother had made for her. She had been there since sometime the previous afternoon. The worker immediately called the police. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with officers and investigators. The cheerful summer morning suddenly felt heavy with grief. The news spread through Newport Beach like wildfire. The little girl in the blue dress had been found, but not the way anyone had hoped. When police arrived at the O'Keefe home to deliver the news, Barbara collapsed. Richard held his wife while Cindy sobbed uncontrollably. In an instant, their worst fear had been confirmed. Linda wasn't coming home, and she would never come home again. The community of Newport Beach was devastated. This was a town that prided itself on safety. Parents here let their children play outside without worry. Kids rode bikes to school alone. People left their doors unlocked. But in one afternoon, all of that innocence had been stolen. A predator had been living among them, hiding in plain sight, and an 11-year-old girl had paid the price with her life. The investigation shifted from a search and rescue operation to a homicide case. Detectives swarmed the Back Bay area, carefully documenting every detail of the scene. They collected evidence, took photographs, and searched for any clue that might lead them to the person responsible. This was 1973, remember. Forensic science was still in its relative infancy. DNA testing didn't exist yet. And there were no security cameras, no cell phone records, no digital footprints to follow. But the investigators working Linda's case were thorough and dedicated. They knew this evidence might be important someday, even if the technology to analyze it didn't exist yet, so they carefully preserved biological samples, storing them in a freezer at the police department. That decision, made by a single crime lab technician who believed in preparing for future possibilities, would prove to be one of the most important choices in this entire case. Detectives began the painstaking work of interviewing everyone who had been in the area that Friday afternoon. Janine and her mother came forward with their account of seeing Linda talking to the man in the turquoise van. That description became the focus of the investigation. So a man in his 20s or early 30s, curly brown hair, tanned skin, driving a turquoise van. Police created a composite sketch based on the witness descriptions. They distributed it to every news outlet in Southern California. They put up posters throughout Orange County. They held press conferences pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Detectives tracked down every turquoise van registered in the county. They interviewed the owners. They checked alibis. They looked for any connection to Linda or her family. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on every tip, no matter how small. They worked around the clock, driven by the need to find justice for this innocent child. But weeks turned into months with no breakthrough. The man in the turquoise van seemed to have vanished into thin air, and no one recognized the composite sketch. No one came forward with information. The van was never found. As time passed, the case began to go cold, not because investigators stopped caring, but because they had exhausted every lead. They had interviewed everyone they could find. They had searched everywhere they could think of. They had done everything that 1970s forensic science allowed them to do. The file on Linda Ann O'Keefe was moved from active investigation to cold case status, but it was never closed. The Newport Beach Police Department made a promise to the O'Keefe family that they would never stop looking for answers. For the family, the pain was unbearable. Barbara blamed herself for not picking Linda up from school that day. That decision, made in a moment of distraction while focused on a sewing project, and would haunt her forever. Richard struggled with anger and helplessness. Cindy lost not just a sister, but a piece of her childhood innocence. The community of Newport Beach was forever changed. Parents no longer let their children walk home from school alone. Doors were locked. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The golden summer of 1973 had become the summer that destroyed a town's sense of safety. Years became decades. The 1970s gave way to the 80s, then the 90s, then the 2000s. Linda's case file gathered dust in the archives, reviewed periodically, but yielding no new leads. The investigators who had worked the case originally retired. New detectives came in, learning about Linda's story, vowing to solve it if they could. But the trail had gone cold so long ago that finding new evidence seemed impossible. Somewhere out there, a killer was living his life. Maybe he had changed his appearance. Maybe he had moved to a different state. Maybe he thought about Linda sometimes, or maybe he had pushed the memory away completely. What he didn't know was that the evidence against him was sitting in a freezer, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for technology to evolve, waiting for the day when the truth would finally be revealed. And that day was coming. Fast forward to 2018. 45 years had passed since Linda's death. Barbara O'Keefe had lived those decades carrying the weight of that one decision, that one phone call, that one moment when she said no to her daughter's request for a ride. Richard had passed away, and never knowing who had taken his daughter from him. Cindy was now in her 60s, having lived more than 5 times longer than her little sister had been given the chance to live. At the Newport Beach Police Department, a new generation of detectives had taken over Linda's case. They had read through the thick file countless times. They knew every detail of that summer day in 1973. They knew about the turquoise van, the witness sightings, the endless interviews that led nowhere. But they also knew something the original investigators didn't have access to: the power of social media. On July 6, 2018, exactly 45 years after Linda disappeared, the Newport Beach Police Department launched something unprecedented. They created a Twitter account in Linda's name, and when they used it to tell her story from her perspective, as if she was speaking directly to the world. The campaign was called #WhoKilledMe, and it was unlike anything law enforcement had ever attempted. The first tweet read, "My name is Linda O'Keefe. I was 11 years old when I was taken and killed. This is my story." What followed was a series of tweets throughout the day, telling Linda's story in real time, 45 years later. Each tweet corresponded to what Linda would have been doing at that exact time on July 6, 1973. At 1 o'clock. "I'm leaving school now. I tried to call my mom for a ride, but she's busy. I have to walk home." At 1:15. "A man in a turquoise van is talking to me. He seems friendly." The tweets were haunting, powerful, impossible to ignore. The campaign went viral almost immediately. Within hours, Linda's story was trending nationally. News outlets picked it up, people shared it across platforms. Millions of people were suddenly learning about an 11-year-old girl who had been killed 45 years earlier. The tweets included photographs of Linda, school pictures showing a smiling girl with long brown hair and innocent eyes. They showed pictures of the neighborhood where she had lived, the school she attended, the area where she was last seen. They showed the composite sketch of the man in the turquoise van, that curly-haired figure who had haunted investigators for decades. The police department's phones lit up with tips. People called in from all over the country. Some had lived in Newport Beach in 1973 and remembered the case. Others had theories or suggestions. Still others simply wanted to express their sympathy and support. But behind the scenes, something even more important was happening. The viral attention had given the police department leverage to try something they had wanted to do for years: advanced DNA testing using forensic genealogy. You see, Those biological samples that had been carefully preserved in 1973 were still there, still viable, still holding genetic information that could potentially identify the killer. The problem had always been that traditional DNA databases only work if the perpetrator is already in the system. But forensic genealogy was different. It used the same kind of consumer DNA testing that companies like Ancestry and 23andMe made popular, but applied it to criminal investigations. By uploading a DNA profile to public genealogy databases, investigators could potentially identify relatives of the perpetrator, then work backward to build a family tree and narrow down suspects. This technique had made headlines earlier in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer after 4 decades. Now, Newport Beach detectives wanted to try the same approach with Linda's case. The viral social media campaign had generated enough public support and attention to justify the expense and effort. The case was back in the spotlight. People cared, and that meant resources could be allocated. Detectives retrieved the preserved biological evidence and sent it to a specialized forensic laboratory. The lab worked carefully to extract DNA from samples that were more than 4 decades old. It was delicate work, requiring patience and expertise. But they succeeded. They developed a complete genetic profile from the 1973 evidence. The profile was run through traditional law enforcement databases first. No matches. The person who killed Linda had never been arrested for a serious crime, or if they had, it was before DNA collection became standard. So investigators took the next step. They uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases, the same ones where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. And they waited. The work of forensic genealogy is painstaking and methodical. It's not like the instant DNA matches you see on television crime shows. It's more like being a detective and a genealogist at the same time, piecing together family relationships across multiple generations. So when the DNA profile from Linda's case was uploaded to genealogy databases, it came back with several distant matches. These weren't close relatives like parents or siblings. These were third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor several generations back. Professional genetic genealogists were brought in to help. These specialists spend their days building family trees, tracking down birth certificates and marriage records, following bloodlines through history. They started with the distant matches and began working backward. They identified the common ancestors, then they worked forward, building out family trees, identifying all the descendants of those ancestors. This process took months. They had to verify each relationship, track down documents, confirm identities. They built massive family trees with hundreds of names, looking for patterns, narrowing down possibilities. They were looking for men who would have been in their 20s or early 30s in 1973. Men who had some connection to Southern California. Men who matched the physical description from the witness. As they worked, the list of potential suspects grew shorter. Names were ruled out as alibis were verified or DNA samples excluded them. Slowly, methodically, the investigation narrowed its focus. By late 2018, the genealogists had identified a strong candidate, a man who fit the age range, who had lived in Southern California in the early 70s, who matched the physical description. His name was James Allen Neal. Detectives immediately began investigating Neal's background, when what they discovered was telling. In 1973, James Neal had been 26 years old. He had curly brown hair. He lived in Southern California. He owned a van. Shortly after Linda's death, Neal had abruptly left California. He moved to Colorado, where he changed his name and essentially created a new identity for himself. He lived under this assumed name for decades, working various jobs, staying under the radar. By 2019, James Neal was 72 years old. He was living quietly in a small town far from Newport Beach, probably thinking he had successfully escaped his past. But science was about to catch up with him. Detectives knew they needed a direct DNA sample from Neal to confirm he was their suspect. So they began surveillance. They watched his movements, documented his routine, and waited for an opportunity. In February 2019, detectives made their move. They approached Neil's home and asked if they could speak with him about an old case from California. Neil agreed to talk. He probably thought enough time had passed that he was safe. Or maybe he was curious about what they knew. Or maybe, after 46 years, he was tired of running. During the interview, detectives collected a DNA sample. It was sent immediately to the lab for comparison with the evidence from 1973. The results came back quickly. The DNA was a match, not a partial match, not a possible match, a definitive, scientific, undeniable match. James Alan Neal was the man in the turquoise van. He was the person who had taken Linda O'Keefe on that July afternoon in 1973. After 46 years of hiding, but the truth had finally found him. Type, "I'm still watching," if you want to hear how this ends, because justice, delayed or not, was finally coming. On February 20th, 2019, 46 years, 7 months, and 14 days after Linda O'Keefe was killed, James Alan Neal was arrested and charged with her murder. The news made headlines across the country. The case that had haunted Newport Beach for nearly half a century had finally been solved. The man in the turquoise van had a name. The Newport Beach Police Department held a press conference. Detectives who had worked the case stood beside officers who had joined the force long after Linda died. Together they announced that forensic genealogy had accomplished what traditional investigation could not. And they thanked the original investigators who had the foresight to preserve the evidence. They thanked the genealogists who had built the family trees. They thanked the lab technicians who had extracted DNA from decades-old samples. And they thanked Linda for never letting them forget her story. For the O'Keefe family, the news brought a complicated mix of emotions. Barbara O'Keefe, now in her 80s, finally had an answer to the question that had tormented her for 46 years. She finally knew who had taken her daughter. Cindy Borgeson, Linda's older sister, spoke to the media. Her words were measured, thoughtful, and remarkably free of bitterness. "For so many years we had no answers," she said. "We didn't know who or why. We just knew that Linda was gone. Now finally, we know the truth. And while it doesn't bring her back, it does bring us peace." The arrest also brought attention to the power of forensic genealogy. Since the Golden State Killer case had proven the technique's effectiveness just a year earlier, law enforcement agencies across the country had been watching Linda's case closely. If it worked again, it would prove this wasn't a fluke. It would prove that cold cases could be solved, no matter how old. And it had worked. Spectacularly. Within weeks of Neal's arrest, police departments across California announced they were reopening cold cases and submitting evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. Cases that had been considered unsolvable were suddenly viable again. James Neal was extradited to California to face charges. The legal process began moving forward. Prosecutors prepared their case. The evidence was strong, overwhelming really. The DNA match was irrefutable. The witness testimony from 1973 still existed. The case seemed solid. But before the case could go to trial, something unexpected happened. Just days before his scheduled arraignment, James Alan Neal was found deceased in his cell. The official cause was listed as natural causes. He was 72 years old and apparently his health had been declining. The news was devastating for everyone who had worked so hard to bring him to justice. After 46 years, after all that effort, after finally identifying him and arresting him, there would be no trial, no opportunity for the family to face him in court, no chance to hear him explain why he had done what he did. By law, the charges had to be dismissed. You cannot prosecute a deceased person. The case file, at which had been open for 46 years, was finally officially closed. But while there would be no courtroom justice, there was something perhaps equally important: the truth. After decades of not knowing, the O'Keefe family knew who had killed Linda. The community of Newport Beach knew who had shattered their sense of safety. The world knew that Linda's story had not been forgotten. Cindy Borgeson addressed the media again after Neal's death, and what she said showed remarkable grace and strength. "I can forgive him," she said quietly. "It doesn't mean I forget what he did to my sister, to my family, to our community. But I choose not to carry hatred for the rest of my life." Linda was gentle, she was kind, she saw good in people. I want to honor her memory by trying to do the same. She paused, collecting herself. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to everyone who never stopped looking for answers, grateful to the scientists who developed these techniques, grateful that my sister's story helped pave the way for other families to find closure. Linda O'Keefe's case became more than just another solved cold case. It became a landmark in forensic science and criminal investigation. It proved that justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. The social media campaign that gave Linda a voice was studied by law enforcement agencies around the world. The hashtag #WhoKilledMe strategy became a template for how to use modern communication tools to breathe new life into old cases. Other police departments launched similar campaigns for their own cold cases. They gave victims voices, they told stories that had been forgotten. They engaged the public in ways that traditional press conferences never could. The use of forensic genealogy exploded after Linda's case. Within months, dozens of cold cases were solved using the same techniques. Victims who had been waiting decades for justice finally got answers. Families who had lived with uncertainty finally knew the truth. In 2021, the Newport Beach Police Department unveiled a memorial plaque in Linda's honor. It was placed in the main hallway of the police station, where officers would see it every day as they reported for duty. The plaque bears Linda's school photograph, showing her gentle smile and innocent eyes. Below the photo, an inscription reads, "In memory of Linda Ann O'Keefe, 11 years old, forever remembered. Justice may rest, but it never sleeps." Every July 6th, and on the anniversary of Linda's disappearance, people still leave flowers at the Back Bay. Residents of Newport Beach, some who remember the case from 1973, and others who only learned about it recently, come to pay their respects. They whisper a name into the ocean breeze. They remember an 11-year-old girl who loved piano and mystery novels, who fed birds and picked wildflowers, who trusted people and saw good in the world. Cindy Borgeson has become an advocate for cold case victims and their families. She speaks at conferences and events, sharing Linda's story and encouraging law enforcement to preserve evidence and never give up on old cases. "If it can happen for us, it can happen for others," she tells audiences. "Never stop asking questions, never stop hoping. Science is catching up. The tools are getting better, and somewhere in a freezer, in an evidence room, is the DNA that will solve the next cold case." The case also sparked important conversations about privacy and the use of genealogy databases in criminal investigations. Some people raised concerns about the implications of law enforcement accessing genetic information that people had submitted for personal ancestry research. These are valid concerns and they deserve thoughtful consideration. When someone uploads their DNA to a genealogy website to learn about their heritage or find distant cousins, they're not necessarily expecting that information to be used in a criminal investigation. The privacy implications are real and complex, but supporters of the technique point to cases like Linda's as proof that the benefits can outweigh the concerns. They argue that the databases used for forensic genealogy are public databases where people have voluntarily uploaded their information. They argue that the technique only identifies suspects, who are then confirmed through direct DNA testing. They argue that families who have waited decades for answers deserve every available tool to find the truth. The debate continues in legal circles, in ethics committees, in state legislatures. Some states have passed laws regulating how and when forensic genealogy can be used. Others are still developing their policies. It's a conversation that balances individual privacy rights with public safety and the pursuit of justice. But Linda's case remains a powerful example at the center of that debate. Here was a child who was killed in broad daylight, whose family suffered for 46 years without answers, whose killer lived freely, probably thinking he had gotten away with it. And when science finally caught him, It was through a technique that wouldn't have been possible even 10 years earlier. The question becomes, if we have the technology to solve these cases, do we have a moral obligation to use it? And how do we balance that obligation against privacy concerns? There are no easy answers, but Linda's family would tell you that having those answers, knowing the truth after so many years, brought them a peace that nothing else could provide. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer used Linda's case to advocate for increased funding for cold case units. He pointed out that advances in DNA technology meant that cases once thought unsolvable could now be cracked, but only if departments had the resources to pursue them. Linda O'Keefe's case shows us that we owe it to every victim to keep trying, he said. Technology is giving us tools our predecessors could never have imagined. But those tools only work if we invest in them, if we train people to use them, if we commit to pursuing justice no matter how much time has passed. The story has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, news articles, and true crime television shows. Each retelling brings Linda's story to a new audience. Each one ensures that she is not forgotten. But beyond the headlines and the statistics and the scientific breakthroughs, there's a simpler truth at the heart of this case. Linda Ann O'Keefe was a real child. She had dreams and fears and favorite colors and songs she loved to play on the piano. She fed ducks and drew pictures and made her own bags from fabric scraps. She trusted a stranger on a summer afternoon, and that trust cost her everything. For 46 years she had no voice, no way to tell her story, no way to seek justice. But then science gave her that voice, social media gave her that platform, and dedicated investigators gave her that justice. The case teaches us something profound about the nature of truth and justice. It shows us that time is not an insurmountable obstacle. That evidence preserved today might solve a case tomorrow, or 20 years from tomorrow, or 46 years from tomorrow. It shows us that the decision of a single crime lab technician in 1973 to carefully freeze biological samples, even though no technology existed to analyze them at the time, could eventually change everything. It shows us that public engagement matters, that social media campaigns can do more than generate likes and shares. They can generate tips and renewed interest and the political will to allocate resources to old cases. It shows us that families never stop grieving, never stop hoping, never stop wanting answers, and that when those answers finally come, even decades later, they bring a kind of peace that nothing else can provide. Most importantly, it shows us that victims are more than just case files and evidence numbers. They are people who are loved, who are still loved, who deserve to be remembered, not just for how they died, but for how they lived. Linda O'Keefe lived for 11 years. She should have lived for 70 or 80 or 90. She should have become a piano teacher. And she should have grown up, fallen in love, had children of her own. She should have experienced everything that was stolen from her on that summer afternoon. But while we can't give her back those years, we can make sure she's not forgotten. We can tell her story, we can learn from her case, we can use the techniques that solved it to solve others. Every cold case represents a person who mattered, a family that's still waiting, a truth that's still hidden. And Linda's case proves that no matter how long that truth stays hidden, it can still be found. As I finish telling you Linda's story, I want you to think about something. Somewhere right now, in an evidence room in some police department, there's a sample of DNA sitting in a freezer. It's from a case that went cold years ago, maybe decades ago. The victim's family has given up hope. The original investigators have retired or passed away. The case file sits in a box, gathering dust, but that DNA is waiting for technology to advance, waiting for someone to decide the case is worth revisiting, waiting for its moment. Linda's DNA waited for 46 years, but when its moment came, it spoke louder than any witness testimony ever could. It told the truth that James Neal had tried to hide for nearly half a century. That's the real lesson of this case. Cold cases are never truly cold. They're just waiting for the right detective to take an interest, waiting for the right technology to become available, waiting for someone to care enough to try. Since Linda's case was solved in 2019, dozens more cold cases have been cracked using forensic genealogy. The technique that found James Neal has found countless others, killers who thought they were safe, who thought enough time had passed, who thought they could hide forever, have been identified and arrested. The technology keeps improving, the databases keep growing, the genealogists keep getting better at building family trees, and that means more cases will be solved, more families will get answers, more victims will get justice. Linda's story is being told in classrooms now, teaching the next generation of forensic scientists and police officers. It's being studied by lawyers and policymakers trying to balance privacy concerns with public safety. It's being shared by victim advocates who want families to know that hope is not lost. The #WhoKilledMe campaign has been analysed and replicated, becoming a case study in how to use social media for public good. Other police departments have launched similar campaigns, giving voices to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. And Linda's image, that school photo showing a smiling 11-year-old girl with brown hair and blue eyes, has become a symbol of persistence, a symbol of justice delayed but not denied, a symbol of hope for every family still waiting for answers. Cindy Borgeson continues to visit Newport Beach regularly. She walks through the neighborhood where she and Linda grew up, past the school Linda attended, down the street where Linda was last seen. The area has changed dramatically since 1973. The houses have been renovated, new families have moved in, children still walk to school, though probably with more caution than Linda's generation did. But the back bay, where Linda was found, remains relatively unchanged. It's still a beautiful natural preserve, still home to birds and wildlife, still peaceful and serene. On one of these visits, Cindy left a small cross among the reeds, marking the spot where her sister was discovered. As she stood there, listening to the wind rustle through the cattails and watching birds glide across the water, she whispered to Linda. "You can rest now," she said softly. "We know who you are. We know who he was. Your story has been told, and it's helping others. You would have liked that, Lenny. You always wanted to help people." The detectives who worked on Linda's case, both the original investigators from 1973 and the modern team that finally solved it, were gathered for a private memorial service at the Newport Beach Police Department. It was an emotional day, bringing together multiple generations of law enforcement officers. Some of the original detectives were in their 80s and 90s now, having carried Linda's case in their hearts for decades. They had worked it as hard as they could with the tools available at the time. They had never given up, even when the trail went completely cold. And now, finally, they could see it solved. They could know that their work, their careful preservation of evidence, their detailed documentation had not been in vain. Chief John Lewis addressed the gathering. "This case reminds us why we do what we do," he said. "Justice doesn't always come when we want it. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades, but it can still come. And when it does, it validates every hour spent investigating, every piece of evidence carefully stored, every family visited to say we haven't forgotten." He paused, looking at the assembled officers. 46 years ago, someone thought he could bury the truth. He was wrong. The truth doesn't stay buried forever, and this case proves it. For every person working on cold cases across the country, Linda O'Keefe's story represents validation. It proves that the work matters, that the late nights spent reviewing old files, the hours spent learning new techniques, the persistence in the face of dead ends. All of it matters, because somewhere in those files is another Linda waiting for science to catch up, waiting for the detective who won't give up, waiting for their voice to be heard. And as long as there are people willing to keep asking questions, willing to keep trying new approaches, willing to believe that truth matters no matter how much time has passed, those voices will eventually be heard. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old when her life was stolen from her on a summer afternoon in 1973. For 46 years, her killer lived free while she remained silent. But silence doesn't mean forgotten, and time doesn't mean defeated. In the end, Linda got to tell her story. DNA gave her a voice that resonated across decades. Social media gave her a platform that reached millions. And dedicated investigators gave her the justice that had been denied for so long. Her story continues to inspire, to educate, to motivate. It reminds us that every victim matters, every family deserves answers.
Yeah, every case deserves another look. Because as Linda's case proved, cold cases are never truly cold. They're simply waiting for their moment. And when that moment comes, the truth will emerge, no matter how deeply it was buried or how long it was hidden. Justice may rest, but it never sleeps. This has been the Untold Cold Case. Thank you for staying with me through Linda's story. If this case moved you, if it made you think about the power of persistence and science and never giving up, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button to join our community. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories. It helps us ensure that victims like Linda are never forgotten. It helps us remind the world that no matter how much time passes, justice is still possible.
Every cold case represents a person who mattered, a family that's still hoping, and a truth that's waiting to be discovered. And every time we tell these stories, we honor those victims and keep their memories alive. Until next time, remember, the truth is patient. Justice may be delayed, but it's never defeated. And somewhere in an evidence room, the next Linda O'Keefe is waiting for her story to be told. Thank you for watching The Untold Cold Case.